Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the first light of dawn glimmering over the Nile. The air is still cool, heavy with the faint scent of damp earth and river reeds. Farmers are already stirring, guiding their oxen toward fields nourished by the annual flood. Palm trees sway gently in the morning breeze, their shadows stretching long across the sand. Boats laden with baskets of figs and jars of beer drift lazily downstream, their sails catching the soft gold of the rising sun. This was the lifeline of Egypt, a ribbon of water threading through an endless desert, bringing life where there would otherwise be none. For men and women alike, the Nile was both provider and prison, shaping every rhythm of existence. Its annual flood was not just a natural event, it was the beating heart of civilization, the reason why Egypt could rise as one of the world's great empires. And yet, while the river promised survival, the lives of women along its banks often told a quieter, harsher story, one hidden beneath the grandeur of temples and pyramids. The Nile was not simply a river. It was a calendar, a teacher, and a god. Its cycle of flooding, planting, and harvesting dictated the pace of life. The people measured time by its moods, celebrated festivals in honor of its bounty, and prayed desperately when the waters failed to rise high enough. A generous flood meant abundant harvests, barley for bread, emmer wheat for beer, flax for linen. A poor flood meant hunger, hardship, and sometimes famine. Families lived at the mercy of this eternal rhythm. For women, the Nile's gifts were both blessings and burdens. The river supplied food, but it also demanded endless labor. While men might plow the fields and tend to larger crops, it was women who ground the grain, kneaded the dough, and brewed the beer that sustained entire households. The Nile gave the raw ingredients, but women's hands transformed them into the staples of life. This work was constant, repetitive, and exhausting. Yet, it was invisible in the grand narratives carved into temple walls or written in the annals of kings. Walk with me now into a village tucked along the riverbank. The houses are simple, built of mud brick, their flat roofs stacked with drying onions and garlic. The streets are narrow, little more than packed earth between rows of homes. Dogs bark, donkeys bray, children dart between adults carrying baskets twice their size. From one doorway comes the sound of a grinding stone, the rhythmic scrape as a woman bends low over heavy slabs of rock, reducing grain to flour. This would be her task for hours, her back aching, her knees pressing into the ground, the dust coating her hair and face. Step into another home, and you find a woman kneeling by the hearth, coaxing fire into life with bundles of reeds. The smell of baking bread mingles with smoke and sweat. Children crowd around, hungry and impatient, waiting for the first loaf to emerge from the clay oven. Life here is not golden like the sunrise on the Nile. It is ordinary, physical, demanding. Yet it is this quiet, uncelebrated labor that keeps the village alive. The Nile also shaped women's daily chores in less romantic ways. Laundry, for instance, was done by hauling garments to the riverbank, soaking them in the current, then pounding them against rocks with clay and ash as primitive soap. It was hard on the hands, and harder still under the scorching sun. Bathing, too, was tied to the river, though most women had little time to linger in its coolness. A quick wash, a rub with perfumed oil, if one could afford it, and then back to work. And yet, despite these hardships, the river also offered moments of reprieve. Picture children splashing in the shallows, while mothers watched from the shore, weaving nets or mending baskets. Picture festivals held on the banks, with music, dancing, and laughter drifting over the water at night. Women sang hymns to Hapi, the spirit of the flood, thanking him for the rising waters. They sang love songs too, verses about longing, passion, and fleeting joy. These were moments when the weight of labor and inequality softened, even if only briefly. The Nile connected not just villages but the entire kingdom. Goods moved along its length, baskets of dates, jars of honey, fine linens, and bright faience beads. For elite women, the river brought luxuries, perfumed oils, imported spices, exotic shells, and delicate jewelry. But for the majority, its gifts remained simple. Enough barley for bread, enough fish to dry and store for leaner months. Life on the Nile was unequal, its abundance tilted heavily toward those with power. To imagine being a woman in this setting is to imagine a life both beautiful and constrained. From birth, her existence was tied to the rhythms of the river. She learned to fetch water in clay jars balanced on her head, to wash and cook and tend, to sew and mend, to comfort children and care for animals. She did these things because they had always been done, and because her survival, and that of her family, depended upon them. The Nile might glisten golden in the sun, but for her, it was also a mirror reflecting the boundaries of her world. Still, there was resilience in these lives. Women found ways to make meaning in small rituals, braiding their hair with care, adorning themselves with beads, singing while they worked. They laughed, they wept, they prayed, they dreamed. They passed stories from mother to daughter, wisdom carved not on stone walls, but into the fabric of daily survival. The Nile, eternal and indifferent, bore witness to it all. Its waters carried the grandeur of pharaohs and the back-breaking grind of villagers alike. And though women's voices were rarely inscribed in the history books, their labor flowed as steadily and silently as the river itself. Without them, Egypt's golden age could not have endured. So as we drift gently along the Nile in our imagination, let us hold both truths: the river as a symbol of beauty and abundance, and the river as a silent witness to the quiet struggles of those whose lives it shaped most intimately. Let us linger now in the soft light of an Egyptian morning, not upon the river's edge this time, but within the walls of a modest mud-brick home. The day is beginning, and with it the life of a little girl whose world will be defined by expectations she did not choose. Childhood in ancient Egypt was short, sweet in fleeting moments, yet heavy with lessons preparing each girl for her role as daughter, wife, and mother. To be born female in this land of gods and kings was both a blessing and a burden. A child's first cry was met with relief, for survival itself was uncertain. Nearly half of all Egyptian children would not live to see their 5th birthday, carried away by fever, infection, or accident. For a mother, every newborn was both a joy and a risk. She knew how fragile life was, and yet hope persisted, for each child carried the promise of continuation, of family, of lineage, of survival. A baby girl was swaddled in linen and cradled against her mother's breast, lulled by lullabies murmured low and rhythmic. Women sang charms over infants, prayers to Hathor, goddess of motherhood, and to Tauret, the hippo-shaped protector of childbirth. Clay amulets in the shape of protective deities might be tied near the cradle, meant to ward off illness and evil spirits. Life began in fragility, wrapped not only in linen, but in ritual and faith. In the earliest years, a little girl's world was much like her brother's. Naked under the hot sun, she toddled through courtyards, splashed at the river's edge, and laughed with siblings in games of tag or stick throwing. Childhood toys have been found buried in tombs: rag dolls with painted faces, carved ivory animals, little balls of clay. For a time, laughter and play belonged to all children alike. But as the years passed, paths began to diverge. A boy, if his family was wealthy enough, might be sent to learn reading and writing at a scribal school. He would sit cross-legged with a reed pen, practicing the graceful curves of hieroglyphs on shards of limestone. A girl, however, remained at home. Her lessons were practical: grinding grain, spinning thread, carrying water jars, tending to younger siblings. She learned by watching her mother, imitating her motions, and slowly absorbing the rhythm of household life. Education, for most girls, was not about letters or numbers. It was about survival skills, the arts of cooking, weaving, and managing a home. Only in rare cases among the elite might a girl learn to read or write? Even then, her literacy often served the household, not herself, keeping accounts, managing servants, or recording goods. For the vast majority, knowledge flowed not through ink on papyrus, but through memory, gesture, and tradition. A little girl's clothing reflected her growing role. In early childhood, she might wear nothing at all, her dark hair cut short to keep away lice and the heat. As she aged, she would be given a simple linen shift, belted at the waist. Beads and shells might adorn her neck, perhaps a lucky amulet hanging close to her heart. Appearance was not vanity but protection, each trinket holding symbolic meaning. A guard against illness, a plea for fertility, a whisper of the divine. Games and joy still had their place. Children sang songs while clapping hands, played tug of war with ropes, or raced through dusty lanes. Girls made little clay dolls with movable limbs, sometimes painted with kohl around the eyes. Yet even play prepared them for adulthood. Doll, like figurines, often carried miniature weaving tools, teaching little hands what they would one day wield in earnest. Childhood was a rehearsal, its games shadows of adult labor. By her 10th or 12th year, a girl was considered nearly grown. Puberty marked a turning point. Her body, once that of a child, was now seen as preparation for marriage and motherhood. A father might begin arranging a union, securing dowries, and ensuring alliances with other families. A girl's future, so soon after her carefree games along the Nile, narrowed into the boundaries of domestic life. Still, affection and warmth existed in these families. Parents loved their children, mourning deeply when they were lost. Mothers braided daughters' hair into long plaits, rubbed perfumed oil into their scalps, and taught them songs of love and lament. Fathers, too, could show tenderness, lifting daughters onto their shoulders, guiding them gently across the threshing floor. In the art painted on tomb walls, we glimpse these moments. Children holding hands with their mothers, girls perched beside fathers during banquets, entire families shown in scenes of harmony. Childhood, then, was both fleeting and precious. It was a brief span of laughter, learning, and preparation. It was filled with beauty, the scent of lotus flowers, the hum of bees around date palms, the cool splash of water as children played. But it was also heavy with expectation, the shadow of adult responsibilities always close at hand. For the little girl by the river, there would be no question of her path. She would grow into a woman defined by the men around her, first by her father's authority, then by her husband's, and finally, if she survived, by her son's. But for now, in this tender window of childhood, she laughed with her friends, sang to her doll, and dreamed by the Nile's edge. For now, the burdens of womanhood could wait. As the day lengthened and the sun beat down upon the village, she followed her mother into the shade of their home. There, beside the hearth, she practiced small tasks, fumbling at first, then steadier with time. Her childhood slipped quietly into apprenticeship, her games fading into labor, her laughter mingling with the grinding stone's steady rhythm. And so the circle continued, generation after generation, each daughter repeating the life of those who came before. Childhood in ancient Egypt was never truly free of care. Yet, in its fleeting joys and small beauties, it carried the seeds of resilience. Those seeds would sustain women later, as they faced the harsher truths of life. For now, though, we leave our little girl to her laughter and her lessons, still sheltered in the golden haze of her earliest years. The world of ancient Egypt was one of breathtaking beauty and staggering complexity. Temples rose like mountains of stone, covered with endless streams of hieroglyphs, their walls whispering the stories of kings, gods, and victories. Scribes sat cross-legged with reed pens in hand, capturing transactions, prayers, and poetry with delicate strokes on papyrus. To the outsider, it might seem that this was a land where words and knowledge flowed as freely as the Nile itself. But the truth is softer, more sobering for most women, and indeed for most of the population, education was a door forever closed. Literacy in ancient Egypt was a privilege, one tightly guarded and limited to a narrow class of scribes, priests, and administrators. To write was to hold power, for the written word was not merely communication, it was sacred. Hieroglyphs themselves were called medu, netja, the words of the gods. Inscribing them was not just recording history, but channeling divine essence. To master this art required years of study, and few families could spare the resources to support a child through such training. For boys of wealthy or ambitious households, there was a chance. A boy might be sent to a house of life, attached to a temple or palace, where he would begin the grueling path of a scribe. His lessons were endless copying texts, memorizing symbols, and reciting aloud until his voice grew hoarse. Teachers struck inattentive students with rods, and mistakes were punished with harsh discipline. But for those who endured, the reward was immense: status, employment, and a place near the beating heart of Egyptian bureaucracy. Girls, however, were almost entirely excluded. Their classroom was the household, their lessons those of labor and care. A girl might sit beside her mother and learn how to grind grain without wasting a kernel, how to weave linen so fine it gleamed in the sun, or how to measure ingredients for brewing beer. These were skills that sustained families, yet they carried none of the prestige of writing. The tools of her education were stones, looms, and clay pots, not reed pens and ink palettes. Still, there were rare exceptions. A handful of elite women are known to have been literate, particularly those attached to temples. Some priestesses of high rank could read hymns, recite rituals, and even keep records of offerings. Wealthy noblewomen, too, may have learned just enough literacy to manage estates, sign contracts, or oversee servants. But these women were unusual, remembered precisely because they stood out. For the vast majority, literacy remained an unattainable luxury. Consider the life of a farmer's wife. She rose at dawn, tended to her children, and prepared food for her family. She might walk to the fields with a basket on her head, collecting reeds or vegetables. Later, she spun thread or kneaded dough until her arms ached. At no point in her day was there room for study or quiet contemplation of texts. Even if she had the time, she had no access to papyrus ink or instruction. Her knowledge was not written in books but carried in her muscles, her caluses, her memory. She learned not through study but through repetition, passing skills from one generation to the next. This divide between literate and illiterate shaped women's lives in profound ways. Contracts, inheritances, and disputes were recorded in writing. Yet a woman often had to rely on a male relative, father, husband, or son, to represent her in legal matters. Without the ability to write her own contracts or petitions, she was dependent on others to give voice to her needs. The law allowed her certain rights, but without literacy, those rights were difficult to exercise independently. And yet, to see women as powerless because they lacked literacy would be to overlook their resilience. Oral tradition flourished where writing was absent. Songs, stories, prayers, and spells circulated from mouth to ear, shaping culture as powerfully as ink and papyrus. Women sang lullabies that carried fragments of mythology. They whispered protective charms over infants, words never written but deeply believed. They remembered recipes, healing herbs, and household lore that scribes never thought to record. This was a different kind of education, less visible, perhaps, but no less vital. The art of weaving, for example, was itself a language. Patterns in linen carried meaning, signaling wealth, family ties, or religious devotion. Cosmetics, too, were applied with knowledge passed down over generations. Mixtures of malachite and galena not only beautified the eyes, but protected them against disease. In this way, women carried sciences of their own, encoded in daily practice rather than hieroglyphs. Even in music and poetry, women found voice. Fragments of love songs from ancient Egypt survive, many of them likely sung by women, verses of longing, joy, and tenderness. These songs, memorized and performed in gatherings, show a literacy of emotion that transcended papyrus. Their words may not have been carved into temple walls, but they linger in echoes, reminders of the hearts that beat beyond the reach of scribes. There is something deeply human in this contrast, the grandeur of hieroglyphs etched into stone, and the simplicity of a mother humming a tune while kneading bread. One was preserved for eternity, the other vanished like breath on the wind. Yet both carried knowledge, both shaped lives. For a girl in ancient Egypt, the lesson was clear. The pen was not for her. Her education lay in survival, in the weight of water jars, in the rhythm of the loom, in the careful tending of infants. She learned early that her worth was measured not by the elegance of her script, but by the strength of her labor and the continuity of her family. Still, we might imagine a young girl peering curiously over her brother's shoulder as he scratched symbols onto a fragment of limestone. She might ask him what they mean, and he might indulge her with a whispered explanation. Perhaps she traced the shapes with her finger, marveling at their mystery, before being called back to her chores. In that fleeting moment, she glimpsed a world she would never fully enter, a world where words could capture thoughts and bind them to eternity. And yet, perhaps she carried those shapes in her imagination, dreaming of them as she wove, as she sang, as she worked. Dreams, too, are a kind of literacy, one unwritten, but powerful all the same. So as we close this chapter, let us remember the women of Egypt may not have left written records in their own hand, but they were authors of another kind. They authored survival, culture, family, and tradition. They wrote not with ink but with their lives, leaving legacies that endured far beyond papyrus scrolls. And in the quiet of the night, as we drift into sleep, we can almost hear their unwritten words whispering still. As the sun dips low over the Nile, and the horizon blurs in shades of amber and rose, let us turn our thoughts to the world of the divine. For in ancient Egypt, gods and goddesses were not distant abstractions. They were everywhere in the rising sun, in the fertile soil, in the cry of a newborn child. Their images gazed from temple walls, their names whispered in daily prayers, their presence woven into every stage of life. And for women, the goddesses of Egypt offered both comfort and contradiction, symbols of power and protection, yet reminders of the limits placed on mortal daughters. Egyptian religion was not rigid but fluid, a tapestry of myths and deities shifting across centuries. Yet certain figures endured, their stories shaping how women understood themselves and their roles. Among these, none was more beloved than Isis. She was mother, sister, wife, and magician, a goddess whose myth touched nearly every aspect of life. In the great story of Osiris, Isis is the devoted wife who gathers the scattered pieces of her murdered husband, restoring him to life long enough to conceive their son Horus. For women, Isis embodied loyalty, resourcefulness, and maternal strength. To call upon her in childbirth, in grief, or in love was to seek divine empathy from one who knew the trials of human life. Beside Isis stood Hathor, goddess of love, music, and joy. She was depicted with cow horns and a solar disk, a symbol of nurturing abundance. Women prayed to her for fertility, for beauty, for the sweet moments of pleasure that lightened hard days. At festivals of Hathor, music and dance filled the night air, and women took part in the celebrations, letting laughter rise like incense. Hathor was gentleness and delight, a reminder that even in a harsh world, there could be moments of sweetness. Another guardian figure was Tauret, the hippopotamus goddess, with pendulous breasts and lion's feet. Though comical to modern eyes, to ancient Egyptians she was fierce protection incarnate. Women called upon Tauret during pregnancy and childbirth, times of immense danger when 1 in 3 mothers might not survive. Her statues stood in households, her image carved into amulets worn close to the skin. She was a constant reminder that even in the shadows of mortality, divine guardianship was near. Bastet, the cat-headed goddess, carried yet another kind of protection. Gentle as a domestic cat and fierce as a lioness, she embodied both nurturing and ferocity. Women prayed to Bastet for safety in the household, for health, and for fertility. Cats themselves were beloved in Egyptian homes, cherished as symbols of Bastet's watchful care. In the purring of a cat curled beside a hearth, a woman might feel the nearness of the goddess herself. These goddesses offered strength and identity, yet the paradox remained in myth. Female figures wielded extraordinary power, but in society, women themselves held far less. Isis restored life, Hathor bestowed joy, and Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess, could unleash divine wrath that toppled armies. Yet mortal women could not lead armies, could not officiate in most temples, could not claim authority in their own right. The divine feminine was revered, but earthly women were restrained. Still, religious rituals gave women certain roles of significance. In homes, women led prayers for fertility, childbirth, and protection. They brewed beer for offerings, baked bread for temple rites, and tended small household shrines with devotion. Women sang ritual songs, shook sistra, sacred rattles, in ceremonies honoring Hathor, and participated in festivals where music, dance, and laughter were themselves forms of worship. Though barred from priesthood in most major temples, women were not excluded from the sacred entirely. Their contributions, though quieter, were threads in the spiritual fabric of Egypt. In elite circles, some women did break through into higher religious office. The most prominent example was the god's wife of Amun, a title held by royal women in Thebes during the New Kingdom. This position gave a woman significant influence, wealth, and ritual authority, though always tied to her connection with the royal family. For most women, however, such heights were unattainable dreams, glimpsed only in temple reliefs, or in processions glimpsed from a distance. Religion also offered women comfort in times of loss. Death was not an end but a transition, and funerary rituals gave assurance that loved ones would live on in the afterlife. Women mourned loudly at funerals, their wails echoing the laments of Isis and Nephthys, who wept for Osiris. Professional mourning women, their hair loose and their bodies dusted with ash, embodied divine grief in ritual performance. Through their cries, the human and the divine were joined in sorrow, granting dignity to the dead and solace to the living. Amulets and charms were another realm, where women exercised agency. A mother might craft or purchase a small faience amulet, shaped like an ankh for life, a scarab for rebirth, or the eye of Horus for protection. She might whisper a spell as she placed it around her child's neck, infusing it with maternal love and divine power. Literacy was not required for these acts of faith. The language of symbols, shapes, and gestures was enough. In the quiet of daily life, women carried religion within them. In songs sung while grinding grain, in prayers whispered while nursing infants, in offerings of bread and beer placed before small clay figures of gods. Their devotion was less about temple grandeur and more about survival, woven into the rhythm of existence. As we drift in thought among these goddesses, we see the paradox clearly. The divine feminine was honored, powerful, indispensable. Yet mortal women walked narrower paths, their lives circumscribed by laws and expectations. Perhaps in their devotion to Isis, Hathor, or Bastet, they glimpsed a reflection of what might have been, a reminder that somewhere beyond human hierarchies, the feminine was sacred, strong, eternal. And so, as night falls on ancient Egypt, and the stars prick the desert sky, we leave these women at their household shrines, their prayers rising softly like smoke. The goddesses they worshipped endure still in myth and memory, their strength a whisper carried through time. For the women of Egypt, the gods were never far away. They were companions in struggle, guardians in danger, and gentle lights against the shadows of their days. The sands of Egypt shimmered beneath a blazing sun, and in that relentless light, appearance carried meaning far beyond vanity. Clothing, cosmetics, and adornment were not merely decoration, they were protection, identity, and even whispers of the divine. For women, how one presented herself to the world was both an expectation and a ritual, shaping daily life from childhood through old age. Imagine standing in a modest home at dawn. A woman unwraps a length of linen, soft from many washings, and pulls it over her shoulders. Linen was the fabric of Egypt, woven from flax grown along the fertile banks of the Nile. Its fibers, pale and airy, offered relief against the heat, though the work of weaving them was long and arduous. Women spun flax into thread, then wove it on looms, sometimes creating cloth so fine it seemed nearly transparent. Clothing ranged from the simplest shifts to elaborately pleated gowns, but nearly all shared this one material: linen, the gift of river and labor alike. For most women, a plain white shift sufficed. Sleeveless, straight, held at the shoulder with straps. It was functional, modest, and light enough to allow movement in the heat of the day. Wealthier women could afford more elaborate styles: dresses with pleated folds that shimmered like ripples of water, or gowns dyed with rare pigments. Jewelry and belts often added color where the cloth did not. Even in simplicity, care was taken to appear neat and graceful. Adornment went beyond cloth. Cosmetics were a daily ritual, practiced by women of many classes. Black kohl was applied around the eyes, not only for beauty, but also for protection. The dark pigment reduced glare from the sun and shielded against eye infections. Green malachite powders were sometimes used as well, thought to hold magical as well as medicinal properties. With a small stick of wood or bone, women lined their eyelids, their faces transformed into the iconic gaze we still recognize in ancient Egyptian art. Perfume and oils played a vital role too. The desert climate was harsh, drying the skin and hair. Women rubbed their bodies with scented oils, mixtures of lotus, myrrh, or frankincense, to soften the skin and leave a fragrant aura. Small cones of scented wax were sometimes placed atop the head during feasts or festivals, slowly melting and releasing fragrance throughout the evening. To smell sweet was to be pleasing not only to others but also to the gods, a sign of purity and care. Hair, too, was carefully managed. Children's heads were often shaved to prevent lice, leaving a single plait or lock as a sign of youth. Women typically wore their hair long, sometimes braided, sometimes adorned with beads or ribbons. Wigs became common, particularly for the wealthy, crafted from human hair or plant fibers. They were not only fashionable but practical, offering relief from the heat and protection from lice. To appear in public with a wig, shining with perfumed oil, was a mark of status and elegance. Jewelry brought color and meaning into daily dress. Beaded necklaces, wide collars of faience or semi-precious stones, bracelets of copper or gold, rings carved with protective symbols, all were common. Even poorer women might wear simple beads or shells. Amulets were especially significant, worn not just for decoration but for protection. A small charm of the goddess Hathor, an ankh for life, or the eye of Horus for health could hang close to the heart, offering comfort and spiritual strength. For wealthier women, appearance was also tied to status. At banquets, they arrived in fine linen gowns, eyes darkened with kohl, lips tinted with red ochre. They smelled of lotus and cinnamon, their wigs thick and lustrous, their collars sparkling with turquoise and carnelian. Their beauty was a display not only of personal care, but of the wealth and resources of their households. Servants attended to their baths, applied their cosmetics, and styled their hair. Beauty was cultivated as carefully as fields along the Nile. Yet even among the less fortunate, appearance carried weight. A farmer's wife might not own gold, but she could wash her linen shift in the river, rub her skin with oil pressed from castor beans, and line her eyes with soot to protect them from the glare. These small acts of grooming were not luxuries. They were essentials, gestures of dignity in the face of daily labor. To neglect them was to risk illness or appear unkempt in a society that valued order, cleanliness, and beauty. Beauty was not only practical or social, it was spiritual. In tomb paintings, women are often depicted as eternally youthful and graceful, regardless of their true age. This was no accident, but a belief that in the afterlife, one would be restored to perfect beauty. The application of cosmetics, the donning of jewelry, the careful arrangement of hair, all were small rehearsals for eternity, reminders that beauty was linked to divine favor and eternal life. Still, there were pressures in these rituals. To be well kept was expected, even demanded, of women. Beauty was a duty as much as a pleasure. A woman's worth in marriage, her social standing, even her sense of self could be tied to her appearance. In this way, cosmetics and clothing were both empowering and limiting, offering women tools of expression, while also reinforcing the narrow roles society imposed upon them. Yet within those constraints, women found joy. They mixed perfumes, experimented with hairstyles, laughed together as they painted one another's eyes. They crafted jewelry not only for survival or duty, but also for pleasure. The sparkle of a bead, the shimmer of pleated linen, the softness of oil on the skin, these were small, tender indulgences that softened the edges of hardship. Picture now, at day's end, a woman seated by lamplight. She unpins her jewelry, setting beads and bangles aside. She unties her wig, combs her hair, and rubs fragrant oil into her skin. In the quiet, she prepares herself for rest, just as she prepared herself for the day that has passed. These rituals, repeated across countless lives, were threads of continuity, connecting mothers to daughters, generation to generation. In the golden world of Egypt, where gods were painted in dazzling colors and kings draped themselves in gold, women too embraced beauty, not always in splendor, but in small daily acts of care. Their clothing, cosmetics, and adornment were more than outward show. They were shields against the desert, prayers in physical form, and affirmations of life itself. And so, as we close this chapter and drift towards sleep, imagine the scent of lotus on the evening air, the shimmer of linen in lamplight, the quiet dignity of a woman tending to her beauty, not for vanity alone, but for strength, protection, and the hope of eternity. In the land where the Nile breathed life into desert sands, family was the foundation of society, and marriage was the structure upon which that foundation rested. For women, marriage was not merely a personal choice or a romance of hearts. It was a necessity, an expectation, and often the defining feature of their lives. Picture a young girl, no more than 12 or 13, standing at the threshold of womanhood. Her hair has grown long, her body is beginning to change, and her family looks at her with new eyes. Childhood is drawing to a close, and soon she will be guided into a role that her mother and grandmother once filled before her, that of a wife and mother. Marriage in ancient Egypt came early, especially for women, while men often married later, in their late teens or early 20s, once they had established some means of support. Girls could be married as soon as they were biologically capable of bearing children. 14 was common, 12 was not unusual. This practice was rooted in both practicality and necessity. Life expectancy was short, and families needed to secure alliances, heirs, and stability before time could snatch those chances away. The choice of a husband was rarely left to the young woman herself. Marriages were arranged by families, negotiated with an eye toward property, labor, and alliances. Love, while not absent from Egyptian society, came second to practicality. A girl's worth was tied to her ability to bear children and manage a household, and her parents were tasked with ensuring she found a husband who could provide for her. In some cases, a dowry or gifts were exchanged, though less formally than in other cultures. Despite the lack of romance, marriage was not without tenderness. Many surviving love poems from ancient Egypt speak of affection, longing, and even passion between husbands and wives. But these soft emotions rested upon a rigid framework of duty. A wife's role was defined clearly. She was to manage the home, raise children, and support her husband's endeavors. Her life became intertwined with his, her identity largely shaped by her relationship to him. Marriage contracts, though not always required, reveal much about these unions. Some documents survive that detail agreements between men and women, listing the dowry a wife brought into the marriage, the property she retained control over, and the provisions her husband would make should he die or divorce her. In these rare glimpses, we see that women could, in theory, protect themselves financially. Yet the reality was more complicated. A woman might own property, but her husband or father often managed it. Legal rights existed, but social expectations limited how freely they could be exercised. For wealthier families, marriage was also a political tool. Alliances were cemented through unions, property exchanged, and fortune secured. In royal circles, the stakes were even higher. Pharaohs married sisters, daughters, and foreign princesses alike, weaving a web of political strategy disguised as matrimony. A queen might share her husband with multiple wives and concubines, each union serving a different purpose. For common women, the stakes were smaller but no less significant. Marriage determined survival, reputation, and stability. For women, the marriage market was less about choice and more about inevitability. A girl raised in a farmer's household might be promised to the son of a neighbor, ensuring that fields stayed tended and labor remained plentiful. A girl from a merchant's family might marry another merchant's son, ensuring both families benefited from shared wealth and trade. In every case, her destiny was shaped not by her dreams, but by the needs of the men around her. There were exceptions, of course. Some women married for love, or at least affection. Records hint at couples who expressed fondness and loyalty, and poetry reveals the tender side of Egyptian relationships. A husband comparing his wife's beauty to lotus blossoms, or a wife describing the warmth she felt when her husband returned from work. Yet these moments, while genuine, unfolded within a society that placed marriage firmly in the realm of obligation. Divorce was possible, and surprisingly common. Unlike in many ancient cultures, Egyptian women could initiate divorce proceedings. Reasons could include infidelity, neglect, or abuse. A woman might leave her husband and, depending on the terms of her marriage agreement, take her dowry and return to her family. Yet while the law allowed for this freedom, social pressures discouraged it. A divorced woman faced stigma and vulnerability, particularly if she had no male relatives to protect her. For widows, the situation could be even more precarious. Without a husband, a woman's security often depended on her sons. If she had none, she might be left destitute, dependent on charity or temple service. A second marriage could provide stability, but it also meant entering again into a system where her autonomy was limited. Marriage was a cycle women could not easily step outside of, no matter their station. In daily life, marriage often meant hard work. A wife rose with the sun to grind grain, fetch water, prepare meals, and tend children. Her husband might labor in the fields, serve in the army, or work as a scribe, but the household was her domain. Her success as a wife was measured not only in children, but also in her ability to keep the home orderly, to maintain harmony, and to support her husband in his duties. Yet within this framework, women found ways to assert themselves. A wife might influence family decisions, manage household accounts, or use her role as mother to shape the futures of her children. Some wielded quiet power, guiding their husbands or ensuring their sons rose to prominence. Still, the boundaries were clear. Her life was tethered to marriage, her worth judged by her performance as wife and mother. Picture, then, a wedding day in ancient Egypt. A young girl, draped in clean linen, her eyes lined with kohl, steps into a modest courtyard. There are no lavish ceremonies, no vows spoken before priests. Marriage was a practical affair, marked by feasting with family, perhaps an exchange of gifts. Neighbors gather, music plays, and food is shared. Beneath the laughter and song lies a sobering truth. This day marks the beginning of a life defined by duty, expectation, and often, limitation. As the sun sets, the bride enters her new husband's home. She carries with her the hopes of her family, the weight of her new responsibilities, and the quiet knowledge that her life is no longer her own. For her, as for countless women before and after, marriage was not a choice but a passage. A step from childhood into a role that would shape every breath of her days. And so, in the stillness of night, when the household rests and the Nile whispers against its banks, we are reminded marriage, in ancient Egypt, was less a romance and more a contract, a binding thread in a society that valued order above all else. For women, it was both sanctuary and snare, shaping their lives as inexorably as the river shaped the land. In ancient Egypt, the rhythms of life flowed as surely as the Nile. Yet for women, no rhythm was more pressing, more defining, than the call of motherhood. From the moment a girl entered marriage, her body became the vessel for her family's hopes, her community's survival, and her society's expectations. To bear children was not only a personal duty, but a sacred obligation, one bound tightly to the gods themselves. Picture a young bride, barely past childhood. Her family and neighbors watch with anticipation, whispering blessings to Hathor, goddess of love and fertility, and to Tauret, the great hippo, shaped goddess who guarded mothers and children. Soon, her role as a wife would give way to the greater expectation that she bring forth life to carry on the household line. For women, motherhood was both a source of honor and a heavy burden. A wife who bore sons earned respect, security, and sometimes influence within her household. A barren woman, by contrast, faced quiet pity, or worse, suspicion and blame. Her inability to conceive could be seen as a curse, a failing of duty. Remedies were sought, prayers were offered, and amulets were worn to encourage fertility. But no charm could guarantee the outcome, and many women carried the silent weight of fear that they might never fulfill their expected role. Childbirth itself was perilous. Without modern medicine, complications were common, and the risk of death hovered like a shadow over every pregnancy. Midwives, often older women with experience, guided mothers through labor, offering herbs, prayers, and comfort. Amulets shaped like Tauret or the goddess Bez were placed nearby, their grotesque forms thought to frighten away evil spirits. Incantations were whispered, calling upon divine protection for mother and child alike. Still, many labors ended in tragedy. Infection, hemorrhage, obstructed birth, any of these could claim a woman's life. Estimates suggest that as many as 1 in 3 women died from childbirth-related causes. The loss rippled outward, leaving infants motherless, households broken, and husbands forced to seek new wives to keep families afloat. The cycle was relentless, and for women, survival was never guaranteed. Even for those who survived, the challenge continued. Infancy was a fragile stage. Without vaccines or modern sanitation, diseases spread swiftly, and half of all children born never reached their 5th birthday. Mothers poured themselves into protecting their little ones, nursing them at the breast, wrapping them in swaddling cloths, soothing them with lullabies. They guarded their children from the desert sun, from disease-ridden waters, from unseen spirits thought to bring sickness. The bond between mother and child was profound, strengthened by both necessity and love. Scenes on tomb walls often show women cradling their babies, nursing them, or holding their hands. These images, preserved in paint and stone, reveal the tenderness that transcended the harsh realities of their world. In those quiet moments, a woman's life, so often defined by labor and limitation, found joy and purpose. Yet, the weight of expectation never lifted. a woman was expected not just to bear children, but many children. Sons to inherit land and care for parents in old age. Daughters to help with household labor and continue the cycle of motherhood. Each birth was celebrated, each child a new blessing, but also a new responsibility. And what of women who bore only daughters, or none at all? Their status in the household was fragile. Sons were the desired heirs, the guarantors of family lineage. Daughters, though cherished, did not carry the same weight in inheritance. A woman who failed to provide sons could find herself replaced, her husband taking another wife or concubine to secure the future of his line. Motherhood was thus a double-edged gift, the source of honor, security, and joy, but also a pathway lined with danger and expectation. Each pregnancy carried risks, each birth carried hope, and each child carried the future of the household on their small shoulders. Religion permeated these experiences. Gods and goddesses were invoked at every stage: Hatha, for conception and childbirth; Tauret and Bes, for protection during labor; Isis, the divine mother who nursed her son Horus in secret. Women looked to these figures as models and protectors, their images carved into amulets, painted on walls, and etched into prayers whispered in the still of night. Through faith, women found strength, even when fear and danger surrounded them. And what of the mothers who lost children? Grief was as much a part of motherhood as joy. Tom inscriptions speak of sorrow for children who never reached adulthood, their small bodies often buried with toys or miniature amulets to comfort them in the afterlife. Mothers bore the weight of these losses silently, their grief folded into the rhythm of life. Even in mourning, the cycle pressed onward. Another child, another hope, another risk. Old age, for the few who reached it, was often a testament to both fortune and resilience. An elderly mother, surrounded by grown children and grandchildren, might live her final years in relative security. But many did not make it that far. For most women, motherhood was both the path and the peril of their short lives. Imagine now, a quiet evening along the Nile. A mother rocks her baby in her arms, humming softly as the stars emerge overhead. Her body is weary, marked by the trials of childbirth and labor, yet her face glows with tenderness. For her, this fragile life cradled against her breast is both her legacy and her burden. She cannot know whether her child will live to adulthood, or whether she herself will survive another birth. But in this moment, she finds joy, fleeting and profound. This was the paradox of womanhood in ancient Egypt. To bring life was to stand on the edge of death. To be a mother was to carry both blessing and burden, joy and sorrow, hope and fear. And yet, across centuries and dynasties, women embraced this role, finding strength in their bonds with children, in their faith in the gods, and in the quiet resilience of their daily lives. As you drift into rest, let the gentle rhythm of the Nile remind you of these women, their struggles, their tenderness, their courage. In the story of motherhood and mortality, we see not just hardship, but the eternal heartbeat of human love, echoing softly across the sands of time. The rhythm of ancient Egyptian life was marked not only by the rise and fall of the Nile, but also by the constant hum of labor. For women, work was both expected and essential, woven seamlessly into the fabric of daily existence. Whether within the confines of the household or beyond its walls, their toil sustained families, supported communities, and silently upheld the grandeur of Egyptian civilization. Picture the early morning hours in a modest village. The first rays of sunlight have barely stretched across the fields when a woman rises from her reed mat. She moves quietly so as not to disturb her children, and with practiced hands, she begins her day. She kneels before a simple stone grinder, pouring dried grain into the hollow, and begins to push the heavy stone back and forth. The steady scrape fills the room as flour collects beneath her hands. It is slow, repetitive, and back-breaking work, yet it must be done each day. Bread was the foundation of Egyptian diets, and women bore the weight of preparing it, often spending hours grinding enough grain for a single household. Inside the home, tasks were endless. Women brewed beer, another staple, by soaking and fermenting bread in water. They spun flax into thread and wove linen for clothing. They tended small gardens, raised chickens or goats, and cared for children while keeping the household in order. Every task was time-consuming, and the tools were simple. A meal of bread and stew might take hours to prepare. Even before the work of collecting water and firewood, life at home was labor without pause, demanding strength, skill, and endurance. Yet, women's labor extended beyond the threshold of their homes. In towns and cities, many women worked alongside men, contributing directly to the economy. Female weavers were especially valued, producing cloth not only for households but for temples, markets, and trade. Workshops bustled with women spinning thread, dyeing fabric, and weaving fine linens destined for the wealthy or for offerings to the gods. Some women became skilled enough to manage their own weaving businesses, passing knowledge and techniques to daughters and apprentices. Other women found work as bakers or brewers, supplying bread and beer to markets, temples, or large estates. In these roles, labor was no less demanding, but it offered the possibility of modest income and a presence in the wider community. Women might also sell produce, pottery, or simple household goods in village marketplaces, standing behind baskets of onions, jars of oil, or small handmade items. Though often humble, such exchanges gave women some degree of agency in an economy otherwise dominated by men. For those of higher status, work looked different. Elite women managed large households, overseeing servants who performed much of the physical labor. But even this role demanded skill. Household accounts had to be maintained, supplies ordered, and estates managed in the absence of husbands or fathers. A wealthy woman might not grind her own grain, but she bore responsibility for ensuring that everyone under her roof, from servants to children, was fed and clothed. In some cases, women even managed land holdings, directing tenant farmers and laborers, though always within the limits set by male guardianship. Some occupations opened doors to unusual positions of authority. Midwives and healers, often women, held important places in their communities. They attended births, offered herbal remedies, and provided care to the sick. Their knowledge, passed down through generations, was essential for survival in a world without formal medicine. Similarly, women served as mourners and funerary workers, singing laments and preparing the dead for burial, roles steeped in both ritual and necessity. There were, however, clear boundaries. Women were excluded from the scribal class, the priesthood, and most official positions. These roles required literacy, education, and religious authority, privileges largely reserved for men. Without access to these paths, women's opportunities for upward mobility remained narrow. Their work, while vital, was often invisible in records dominated by male scribes who celebrated kings, generals, and officials, but rarely the women who sustained their households. Even so, women found quiet strength in their labor. Work was a source of identity, pride, and sometimes companionship. In the fields, women bent alongside men during harvest season, singing songs to pass the hours under the blazing sun. In workshops, groups of women wove and spun together, sharing stories and laughter as their hands moved in practiced rhythm. Within the home, mothers taught daughters the skills they would need to survive, binding generations together through shared tasks. Yet, the toll was undeniable. Grinding grain wore grooves into bones and teeth. Hours of stooping and carrying water left backs hunched and joints stiff. Archaeological evidence shows the marks of labor etched into women's skeletons. Arthritis from heavy lifting, worn knees from kneeling at grinding stones, teeth ground down from grit in bread baked with sandy flour. Work was not only a daily demand, but a physical burden carried across a lifetime. And still, work never truly ended. Even in old age, Women often continued to labor as best they could, helping with children or lighter tasks. For widows without family, work might mean survival, selling small goods or laboring in temples for food and shelter. The cycle of toil, begun in youth, often continued until death. Yet, within this labor, there was also dignity. Work tied women to the rhythms of the Nile, to the pulse of their communities, to the very survival of Egypt itself. Without their bread, their linen, their care, society could not function. Though their names are rarely preserved in stone, their contributions were carved deeply into the life of their world. Imagine, now, the close of a long day. A woman wipes flour from her hands, her shoulders aching from hours at the grinding stone. She sets a loaf of bread on the hearth, ladles stew into bowls, and calls her children to eat. Outside, the sky darkens over the river, the stars beginning to glow. Her work is never done, yet in this moment, surrounded by family, she finds a measure of peace. So it was for countless women across centuries. Their labor, unseen by history's grand monuments, was the heartbeat of daily life. In their hands, the home was sustained, the economy enriched, and the very lifeblood of Egypt carried forward. Their work, though humble, was a legacy as enduring as the pyramids, rising beyond the horizon. In the grand story of ancient Egypt, the ability to read and write was a gift reserved for the few. The written word, carved into stone or brushed onto papyrus, carried not just information but power. Power to record laws, preserve prayers, and immortalize kings. For women, however, education was a narrow doorway, often left closed. Their lives were defined less by scrolls and ink than by the spoken word, the memory of stories, and the rhythm of daily tasks. Imagine a small village school at dawn, where boys sit cross-legged in the dust with tablets of wood coated in plaster. A stern teacher walks among them, correcting their clumsy hieroglyphs with a reed pen. The boys recite lines of wisdom, their voices rising in unison lessons of loyalty, morality, and obedience. They dream of becoming scribes, officials, or priests, men whose knowledge of the written word would open doors to power and respect. But where are the girls? At home, beside their mothers. Their education, though no less important, is practical rather than scholarly. They learn how to grind grain, weave linen, tend children, and manage the household. Their lessons are spoken, shown by example, and reinforced through daily repetition. A girl's schooling prepared her not for temples or court, but for marriage and motherhood. There were exceptions. Some women of wealth or high status may have received basic literacy, enough to read household accounts or sign contracts. A few remarkable cases suggest women could even become scribes or hold religious offices requiring literacy. But these were rare, so rare that their names stand out as exceptions carved into history, rather than common threads in society's fabric. For most women, literacy was unnecessary in the eyes of the world. Why should a mother read when her husband or son could record transactions? Why should a daughter write when her duty was to weave, cook, and nurture? This logic, shaped by a deeply patriarchal society, confined women's intellectual opportunities. The written word was not forbidden to them by law, but by custom and expectation. Still, women were not cut off from knowledge. Oral tradition was strong in Egypt, and women were often keepers of memory and wisdom within families. They told stories of gods and heroes to their children, passed down recipes and remedies, and sang songs at festivals and funerals. Knowledge flowed through them in ways that required no pen, no papyrus, but memory and voice. In this way, women carried a different kind of literacy, one rooted in life itself. Religion, too, offered women encounters with the written word. Hymns and prayers were recited in temples, and even if women could not read the texts, they knew the rhythms and meanings by heart. Amulets bore inscriptions, and tomb paintings carried spells meant to guide souls into the afterlife. While men wrote them, women lived by them, their faith shaping each moment of their lives. And yet, One cannot help but imagine the quiet yearning of some women who glimpsed the power of writing, but could not claim it. Perhaps a young girl watched her brother trace hieroglyphs in the sand, her fingers itching to follow his lines. Perhaps a wife overheard her husband reading aloud from a contract, wondering what it would feel like to decipher the signs herself. The barriers were invisible but strong, reinforced by centuries of tradition. The difference in education shaped more than opportunity, it shaped memory. Men's lives, written down, preserved in tomb inscriptions and papyrus scrolls, could echo across millennia. Women's lives, unwritten, faded more quickly into silence. We know the names of kings, generals, and scribes, but the names of countless wives, mothers, and daughters are lost. Their stories preserved only in the faintest traces, a comb in a grave, a spindle whorl, a painted figure on a wall. Yet absence does not mean insignificance. Women's voices still reached through time, if not in writing, then in song, prayer, and tradition. They shaped their children's minds, guided their households, and maintained the continuity of culture across centuries. Their knowledge, though rarely recorded, was vital, practical, spiritual, and enduring. There were, of course, women who stepped beyond boundaries. The rare female scribe, though nearly invisible in records, reminds us that exceptions existed. Queens and priestesses, too, engaged with literacy in some form, commissioning inscriptions, decrees, or hymns in their names. Nefertiti and Cleopatra, remembered as powerful rulers, surely understood the weight of the written word, even if they did not wield the pen themselves. These figures show us that the door was not entirely closed, only heavily guarded. For the vast majority, however, knowledge came through experience, observation, and oral tradition. A girl learned from her mother how to weave, from her grandmother how to prepare a ritual meal, from her community how to mourn the dead or celebrate a festival. Her education was woven into the fabric of life itself, leaving no scrolls or inscriptions, but shaping the culture in ways as enduring as stone. Picture now a quiet evening in a modest household. A mother sits with her daughter by the glow of a small oil lamp. She shows her how to twist flax fibers into thread, her hands steady from years of practice. As they work, she tells stories of Isis nursing Horus, of brave queens and clever goddesses. The girl listens, her small hands fumbling with the fibers, her mind alive with images of gods and heroes. This is her education, not ink and papyrus, but voice, memory, and skill. In the silence of the desert night, one truth becomes clear. While women were largely denied literacy in the written sense, they nurtured another kind of learning, no less powerful. They carried Egypt's traditions forward, not in ink, but in living practice. Their lessons endured not through carved hieroglyphs, but through the children they raised, and the communities they sustained. So, as you drift into rest, imagine the quiet scratch of a reed pen on papyrus, balanced by the soft murmur of a mother's story in the lamplight. Two kinds of knowledge, one written, one spoken, both essential to the life of ancient Egypt. And though history may remember more of one than the other, both left their mark upon the golden sands of time. The temples of ancient Egypt were more than places of worship. They were centers of wealth, knowledge, and power. Rising high above villages and fields, their walls carved with sacred texts and painted with images of gods. These sanctuaries embodied the spiritual and political heart of the kingdom. The priests who served within them did not merely lead prayers. They managed estates, oversaw rituals, and often advised the pharaoh himself. To be part of the priesthood was to hold both honor and influence. Yet for most women, this path was firmly closed. Picture the scene: the temple of Karnak at dawn. The massive pylons stand against the sky, their tops gilded by the first rays of the sun. The air is filled with incense, its sweet smoke rising like whispered prayers. Priests, dressed in spotless white linen, perform purification rites, washing in sacred lakes before stepping inside the holy chambers. Their voices echo in solemn chants, calling upon Amun, Mut, and Khonsu to bless the land. It is a space of reverence and ritual, guarded by tradition, and in this world, women were outsiders more often than participants. The exclusion was not absolute. Women could and did serve in religious roles, especially as singers, dancers, or attendants in temple ceremonies. The title of Chantress of Amun appears often in inscriptions granted to women who performed music during rituals. These roles, however, carried little authority. They were important for the atmosphere of worship, but did not grant women access to decision-making or sacred knowledge. The most powerful offices: High Priest, Lector Priest, Overseer of Temple Estates, were almost always reserved for men. Why this restriction? Partly, it reflected the patriarchal order of Egyptian society. Men were considered natural mediators between gods and people, their authority reinforced by law, tradition, and mythology. The gods themselves were often depicted in male form. Ra the sun, Osiris the ruler of the underworld, Amun the hidden force behind creation. Women had goddesses to revere: Isis, Hathor, Nephthys, and these divine figures were immensely important, embodying love, protection, and magic. But when it came to real-world religious offices, men dominated the sacred hierarchy. There were exceptions, of course. In certain periods, royal women wielded extraordinary religious power. The title, God's Wife of Amun, given to high-ranking princesses or queens, grew especially significant during the New Kingdom. These women presided over rituals, controlled temple resources, and sometimes rivaled priests in authority. The role was both spiritual and political, binding royal women to the heart of Egypt's most powerful temple. And yet, this privilege was limited to a tiny few at the very top of society. The vast majority of women, even noble ones, never crossed the threshold of true priesthood. For ordinary women, religious life unfolded at the edges of the temple walls or in small household shrines. They prayed to protective deities, offered food and flowers, and whispered private petitions to goddesses like Tauret, the hippo-shaped guardian of childbirth, or Bes, the dwarf god who warded off evil spirits. These home rituals were intimate and deeply meaningful, but carried no public recognition. A woman could light a lamp for Hathor, sing a hymn to Isis, or wear amulets inscribed with protective spells. Yet she would never stand at the altar of Amun, or read aloud the sacred texts that guided ceremonies. This exclusion shaped how women experienced religion. While men moved within the grand spaces of the temple, handling offerings and performing elaborate rites, women's faith was expressed in personal, everyday acts of devotion. The difference was not one of belief but of access. Men's rituals were recorded, carved into stone, remembered by history. Women's prayers, offered in whispers, disappeared into the air, known only to the gods who received them. And yet, the strength of women's faith was profound. Archaeologists have uncovered countless small figurines, charms, and amulets from household shrines, silent testimony to women's constant dialogue with the divine. These objects reveal a religion lived at ground level, woven into childbirth, healing, protection, and daily survival. Women may have been excluded from priesthood, but they were not excluded from belief. In fact, their devotion shaped the spiritual fabric of everyday life, as deeply as any temple ceremony. It is tempting to imagine what might have been if women had enjoyed broader access to the priesthood. Would they have left behind their own hymns, their own theological insights carved in stone? Would their perspectives have shifted the course of Egyptian religion, giving greater voice to goddesses and feminine ideals? These questions linger like unrecorded prayers, echoing in the silence left by their absence. Still, even within their limitations, women found ways to exercise religious authority. A mother teaching her daughter a protective charm, a midwife invoking Tauret during labor, a grandmother telling the story of Isis and Osiris by the hearth. These were acts of priesthood in their own right, though never formally recognized. Through them, divine presence entered the home, blessing the rhythms of family life. Now, let us return once more to the temple at dawn. The gates open, and priests file inside with offerings of bread, beer, and incense. Outside, a woman kneels in the dust with her child, lifting her hands in prayer. She will never walk into the Holy of Holies, never speak the sacred words inscribed on the walls. Yet in her heart, the gods are no less real, her faith no less deep. Her exclusion from priesthood did not diminish her devotion, it only pushed it into quieter, more personal spaces. So, as you drift deeper into rest, imagine those two worlds. The grandeur of temples, where men chanted prayers in echoing halls, and the simple home shrines, where women whispered their hopes to the gods. Both belonged to Egypt, both sustained its spiritual life. And though history records one more clearly than the other, the gods surely heard them both. Marriage in ancient Egypt was less a romantic affair and more a practical arrangement, woven into the fabric of daily survival. It was the expected destiny for nearly every woman, shaping her place in society and determining her responsibilities for the rest of her life. While love may have blossomed within some unions, and ancient poems suggest it often did, marriage was, above all, a contract, a union of households, property, and expectation. Picture a small village along the Nile. The day is warm, the air alive with the hum of cicadas. In one mud-brick courtyard, a family prepares for a wedding. Clay pots are stacked neatly against the wall, jars of beer are brewed in anticipation, and women chatter as they knead bread for the feast. The bride, perhaps no more than 14 or 15 years old, sits quietly as older women braid her hair and anoint her with fragrant oils. She does not wear white, nor does she walk down an aisle, but still, the day marks the beginning of her adult life. Unlike some other ancient cultures, Egyptian marriage did not require an elaborate ceremony sanctioned by priests. A simple agreement between families, often recorded in a contract, was enough. Such contracts outlined property arrangements, dowries, and inheritance rights. In this way, marriage was not just a social bond, but also a legal and economic one, ensuring that both families were protected in the event of divorce or widowhood. For women, this contract could offer a small measure of security, a rare protection in a world tilted so heavily toward men. Within the home, the roles of husband and wife were sharply defined. The man was the head of the household, responsible for labor in the fields, trade, or craftwork. The woman managed the domestic sphere, overseeing food preparation, weaving, and the care of children. Though modest in scope, this work was vital. Bread and beer, the staples of life, were prepared almost entirely by women's hands. Linen, essential for clothing and ritual, was spun and woven by them as well. A household could not survive without a wife's constant labor. Children were at the heart of marriage. A woman's worth was often measured by her ability to bear sons, who would continue the family line and provide security in her later years. Daughters, too, were cherished, though their future often meant joining another household. Childbirth was frequent and perilous. Women endured multiple pregnancies, with many lives lost in the process. A family with 5 surviving children might have mourned twice that number. Amid this cycle of birth and loss, motherhood defined much of a woman's identity. Despite these hardships, evidence suggests that Egyptian marriages were not entirely devoid of affection. Love poems from the New Kingdom, written in tender tones, speak of longing, devotion, and joy between men and women. "My brother fills my heart with joy," one young woman declares in a verse, using the word brother, not literally but as a term of endearment for her lover. These poems remind us that beyond contracts and duties, real feelings could and did exist. Marriage was not unbreakable. Divorce was relatively common in ancient Egypt, and both men and women could initiate it. A woman who left her husband might return to her family, or remarry. her rights protected by the terms of her marriage contract. This freedom set Egyptian women apart from many of their contemporaries in Greece or Mesopotamia, where divorce could carry heavy stigma or punishment. Still, divorce was often easier for men, who faced fewer social consequences. For widows, life was more uncertain. If a woman lost her husband, her fate depended largely on whether she had sons to support her. A son could inherit his father's property and provide for his mother, but a widow without children risked poverty and dependence on extended family. Some widows found refuge in temples, working as servants or musicians, but many faced a precarious existence, their security as fragile as the reed mats on which they slept. Marriage also shaped social status. Among the wealthy, unions could be tools of power, binding noble families together or securing royal bloodlines. Queens often married their brothers or close relatives to keep dynastic power within the family. Among common people, marriages were more practical, linking households of similar standing with dowries consisting of simple goods, livestock, clothing, or jars of grain. Whether in palace or village, marriage tied women firmly to their role as wife and mother, their identity defined by the men they joined. Yet within the household, women did wield influence. They managed food stores, supervised servants if the family could afford them, and organized the rhythms of daily life. In inscriptions and artwork, wives are sometimes depicted standing beside their husbands, not behind them, suggesting a partnership of sorts. A husband might rely on his wife's skill in managing household affairs, as much as she depended on him for external support. It was not equality, but it was interdependence, a balance born of necessity. The intimacy of family life also carried moments of warmth. Imagine an evening at home. A father returns from the fields with a basket of fish, while the mother kneads dough for bread. Their children play at their feet, laughing as they chase a pet cat through the courtyard. In the lamplight, the family eats together, their laughter and stories echoing into the desert night. These small, ordinary moments, unrecorded in scrolls or contracts, reveal the human side of marriage in Egypt, where love, duty, and survival blended into the rhythm of daily life. So, as you rest, picture the quiet strength of women who lived through this system. Brides leaving their childhood homes, wives managing households, mothers raising children against the backdrop of a harsh world. Their marriages may not have promised equality, but within them, women found ways to nurture, to influence, and to endure. And in the soft silence of the Nile's eternal flow, their voices, though seldom written, still linger, as constant as the river itself. When we think of the monuments of ancient Egypt, the pyramids, the temples, the towering statues of gods and kings, it is easy to imagine a society of splendor and wealth. But behind this grandeur lay the constant hum of daily work, much of it carried out quietly, tirelessly, and almost invisibly by women. For them, domestic labor was not just a responsibility, it was the very foundation of survival. Step into a modest household on the banks of the Nile. The home is built of mud brick, its walls plastered smooth and painted in pale earth tones. The roof is flat, used for drying grain or storing baskets. Inside, the air is dim, cool against the desert heat. At dawn, before the sun has risen high, a woman is already at her tasks. She kneels beside a stone quern, grinding grain into flour, her arms moving rhythmically, hour after hour. The sound of stone on stone echoing like a slow heartbeat through the room. Bread was the staff of life in Egypt, eaten at nearly every meal, and making it was a laborious process. First came the grinding, then mixing the flour with water, kneading it by hand, shaping loaves, and finally baking them in clay ovens heated by wood or dried reeds. The bread was often coarse, flecked with bits of grit from the grinding stones, which wore down teeth over time. Still, without a woman's daily labor, a family would go hungry. Beside bread came beer, another staple of the Egyptian diet. Women brewed it in large jars, soaking bread or barley in water and fermenting it to create a thick, nourishing drink. Beer was consumed by rich and poor alike, not merely as a luxury, but as a safe and filling source of calories in a land where clean water was scarce. Brewing was a constant task, its earthy smell filling courtyards and kitchens, a reminder of women's steady contribution to life's essentials. Beyond food, women spun flax into linen, one of Egypt's most valued materials. The process was slow and demanding, pulling fibers from the flax plant, spinning them into thread, and weaving them into cloth on simple looms. Linen was needed not just for clothing, but for religious rituals, for trade, and for wrapping the dead in preparation for burial. The production of linen fell largely to women's hands, connecting their labor to both the daily life of the living and the eternal life of the dead. Childcare was another constant burden. A woman's day unfolded around her children, feeding them, protecting them, teaching them the skills they would need. Infants were swaddled and carried close, older children given tasks to help in the household. Yet childrearing was shadowed by grief. High mortality rates meant that many mothers mourned as often as they rejoiced, enduring the loss of babies and toddlers to illness and accident. Still, they pressed forward, pouring love and labor into those who survived. Water collection was also women's work. Picture a woman walking to the Nile or a village well, balancing a heavy jar on her shoulder. The sun is merciless, the jar weighs more with every step, yet she makes the journey daily, sometimes several times. Without her, there would be no water for cooking, washing, or drinking. Her burden is silent, but her effort sustains life. And the burdens did not stop there. Women tended animals, gathered reeds for fuel, cleaned living spaces, and made household items from clay or fiber. Each day was a cycle of repetitive, exhausting tasks, with little room for rest. For wealthy women, servants or enslaved laborers might ease some of these responsibilities, but for the majority, the work was unrelenting. It is easy to imagine these tasks as menial, yet they were the backbone of Egypt's economy and culture. Temples could not rise, pharaohs could not reign, and armies could not march without the bread, beer, and linen that women produced. Their domestic labor was not celebrated in inscriptions or carved into tomb walls, but it was as vital as any king's decree. And yet, the physical toll was immense. Hours of grinding grain left women with damaged joints and worn teeth. Carrying heavy jars caused bent spines and aching shoulders. Archaeological studies of female skeletons reveal the marks of hard labor, arthritis, fractures, and premature aging. For many, old age came early, if it came at all. But within this burden, there were moments of connection and resilience. Women often worked together, grinding grain side by side, spinning flax while sharing stories, singing songs as they kneaded dough. In these shared rhythms, they built bonds of sisterhood, finding comfort in the company of others who carried the same weight. Their voices, rising in laughter or in lament, softened the harsh edges of daily toil. Imagine an evening after a long day of labor. The bread is baked, the beer jars sealed, the children asleep. A woman sits on the flat roof of her home, looking out across the fields toward the setting sun. The air cools, the desert stars emerge, and for a brief moment, she is free from the endless cycle of work. Tomorrow it will begin again. The grinding, the kneading, the weaving. But tonight she allows herself to rest, knowing her efforts keep her family alive. So, as you close your eyes, think of these women not only as laborers, but as quiet pillars of their world. Their hands shape the daily rhythm of Egypt, their work hidden yet essential. In every loaf of bread, every jug of beer, every length of linen, echoes the unrecorded lives of women, whose labor sustained one of the greatest civilizations on earth. Their burdens were heavy, but their strength was greater still, as constant as the Nile, flowing through the heart of Egypt. To be a woman in ancient Egypt was to live with constant awareness of the mysteries and perils of the body. Nowhere was this truer than in childbirth, a moment that promised both joy and mortal danger. For Egyptian women, pregnancy and delivery were not simply natural events, but thresholds between life and death, carefully guarded by tradition, magic, and the steady hands of midwives. Picture a small home in a Nile-side village. The air is heavy with the scent of incense, the sound of hushed voices filling the room. A woman labors on a low birthing stool, her knees drawn up, her face glistening with sweat. Around her, other women, sisters, mothers, neighbors, offer support, while the midwife gives calm instructions. In her hands lies no metal instrument, no advanced medicine, but rather knowledge passed down through generations. How to soothe, how to comfort, how to coax new life into the world. Egyptian medicine blended practical skill with spiritual protection. Midwives relied on herbs and natural remedies, honey for wounds, garlic for infections, castor oil to ease the body. But alongside these treatments came ritual. Amulets shaped like Toret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth, or Bes, the dwarf god who frightened away evil, were placed nearby. Incantations were spoken, charms written on papyrus, prayers whispered to Isis, who had nursed Horus after hiding him from Seth. In Egypt, the physical and the divine were never separate. Both were needed to protect mother and child. And still, childbirth was perilous. Without modern medicine, complications could swiftly turn deadly. Archaeological evidence suggests that as many as 1 in 3 women might die in childbirth or from related infections. For families, this meant repeated loss. For women, it meant living each pregnancy with the shadow of death close at hand. To bear many children was expected, but it was also a gamble of survival. Children, too, were vulnerable. Even if a baby survived birth, disease and malnutrition claimed many within their first years. Small graves, sometimes found beside family homes, remind us of the frequency of such losses. Mothers mourned quietly, then faced the reality of becoming pregnant again. Their lives caught in an unending cycle of risk and renewal. Medical knowledge in Egypt was surprisingly advanced in some respects. Papyrus texts such as the Ebers Papyrus and the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus detail treatments for women's health, including contraceptive mixtures made from honey, acacia, and dates. There were tests to predict pregnancy, some involving barley seeds watered with a woman's urine to determine if she would bear a boy or a girl. These practices may seem strange to us, but they reflect an earnest attempt to understand and control the mysteries of fertility. Midwives themselves held an honored, if understated, place in society. Though rarely named in inscriptions, their role was essential. They were the guardians of women's health, the ones called upon when new life entered the world. Their expertise was practical rather than scholarly, learned through experience rather than writing. But it was vital. In a world without doctors for the poor, the midwife was healer, counselor, and protector. Even queens were not immune to these dangers. Royal women, despite access to resources and attendants, faced the same risks of bleeding, infection, and difficult labor. Childbirth did not spare the elite. Many royal mothers are known to us only through inscriptions marking their deaths, sometimes at tragically young ages. The grandeur of palaces and tombs could not shield them from the same fragility of life faced by peasants along the Nile. To manage this constant threat, Egyptian religion offered comfort. Goddesses associated with fertility and protection became beloved figures in women's lives. Toret, with her fierce tusks and rounded belly, was carved on amulets and painted on walls, a reminder that even the most ungainly form could embody strength. Hathor, goddess of love and motherhood, was invoked for safe pregnancies. Isis, who resurrected her husband Osiris and nursed their son Horus, became the very image of maternal devotion. Through these divine figures, women found reassurance that their struggles were seen and shared by the gods. But even with faith, the toll was immense. Many women did not live beyond their 30s, their lives cut short by the repeated strain of pregnancies. Those who did survive bore the scars of their endurance: weakened bodies, damaged bones, and memories of losses carried silently. Yet within this hardship lay extraordinary resilience. Women persisted, generation after generation, ensuring the survival of Egypt's families, fields, and future. Imagine again that small village home. The midwife has finished her work, and the cries of a newborn fill the air. The mother, exhausted, leans back against the birthing stool, her hands reaching for the tiny life placed upon her chest. For this moment, at least, there is joy. Outside, the Nile flows steadily on, indifferent yet eternal, as it has for thousands of years. So, as you drift into rest, remember these women, whose lives were shaped by both strength and fragility. Their labors were perilous, their losses many, but through them Egypt endured. In every child who survived, in every family line that continued, we glimpse the quiet heroism of mothers, midwives, and healers. Women who, though seldom named, carried the weight of life itself in their hands. When we picture ancient Egypt, we often imagine the grandeur of temples, the bustle of markets, or the majesty of pharaohs. Yet, behind these images stood countless ordinary women, whose daily work extended beyond the household walls into trades that were both humble and essential. Though barred from the priesthood, from government, and from positions of political power, women still found ways to labor for their families and communities. Among the most common paths were weaving, baking, and brewing, industries that fed and clothed Egypt and kept its people alive. Imagine the weaving workshops of Thebes or Memphis. In long airy rooms, rows of looms stand upright, their frames strung with flax fibers. Women move carefully between them, their fingers deftly pulling threads, passing the shuttle back and forth. The sound of looms is steady, rhythmic, almost musical, like the quiet pulse of a heartbeat. Linen, the great fabric of Egypt, is being born here, not in palaces, but in workshops filled with women. Weaving was no small task. Flax fibers had to be softened, spun into thread, and then worked into cloth. Linen clothed peasants and nobles alike, though its quality varied. Coarse and simple for the poor, fine and transparent for the wealthy. Linen also played a central role in religion and death, wrapping the bodies of the dead in endless strips for burial. Every piece of linen required hours of labor, and much of that labor came from women, whose names are long forgotten. Their work linked them not only to the living but to the eternal, as the fabric they produced accompanied souls into the afterlife. Bread and beer, too, were industries deeply tied to women. Archaeological finds at Amarna and other sites show large bakeries and breweries, often staffed primarily by women. In smoky rooms, women kneaded dough, shaped loaves, and slid them into domed clay ovens. The smell of baking bread filled the air, mingling with the yeasty tang of fermenting beer. These were not luxuries, but necessities. Bread and beer formed the diet of nearly every Egyptian, from laborers building pyramids to priests performing sacred rituals. Women in these trades worked not only for their families, but often for temples or estates. Great households and religious complexes required steady supplies of food and cloth, and women were employed to meet these demands. Payment might come in the form of grain, oil, or simple goods, which in turn supported their households. Though their wages were modest, this labor gave women a measure of independence, allowing them to contribute visibly to the economy. Yet the conditions were rarely easy. The heat of ovens, the dust of grinding flour, the endless repetition of brewing jars and weaving looms. These tasks demanded stamina and patience. The women who performed them often bore the marks of their work: calloused hands, aching backs, and worn joints. Still, their efforts were indispensable. Egypt's great temples could not function without bread for offerings. Its armies could not march without beer for sustenance. Its markets could not thrive without linen to trade. There is a quiet dignity in imagining these women at their work. Picture a young girl learning to spin thread beside her mother, her small hands fumbling with the fibers. Or an older woman, her face lined by years of labor, skillfully shaping loaves of bread in a workshop filled with laughter and chatter. These scenes may lack the grandeur of royal processions or temple rituals, but they capture the real heartbeat of Egypt, the steady rhythm of ordinary lives sustaining an extraordinary civilization. Sometimes, women's work in these industries blurred the line between home and marketplace. A woman might weave at home, selling surplus cloth at the local market, or brew beer in her courtyard, trading jars for fish or grain. These small exchanges brought her into the economic life of her village, giving her a role beyond the household. Though rarely recorded in official texts, such informal trade gave women practical influence within their communities. It is worth noting that, while women contributed greatly to these trades, their labor was often undervalued compared to men's. A man might be remembered as a master craftsman, his name inscribed in records, while women who wove, baked, or brewed in equal measure remained anonymous. Their hands shaped Egypt's essentials, but their identities faded quickly into silence. And yet, traces remain. In tomb paintings, women are shown baking, brewing, and weaving, captured in the vivid colors of daily life. Archaeological remains, looms, bread molds, beer jars, speak of their constant presence. Though history recorded the names of kings and priests, the quiet work of women still lingers in clay and fiber, reminding us of the unseen foundation of Egyptian society. As night falls, imagine the workshops growing quiet. The looms stand still, the ovens cool, the jars of beer rest in the shade. Women return home, tired but steady, their work complete for another day. Their lives may not have been carved in stone, but their labor fed Egypt, clothed its people, and sustained its rituals. In every thread of linen, every loaf of bread, every sip of beer, their presence endures, humble, constant, and essential. So, as you drift into rest, let the rhythm of their work soothe you. The sound of weaving looms, the warmth of ovens, the soft bubbling of fermenting beer. These were the lullabies of daily life in ancient Egypt. Through them, the women of the Nile left a legacy not of monuments, but of sustenance, woven quietly into the very fabric of their world. When we think of ancient Egypt, we might imagine the bright glimmer of gold, the smooth white limestone of temples, and the cool, clean waters of the Nile. Yet for most women, daily life was not lived in marble halls or perfumed courtyards. It was lived in small mud-brick homes, in dusty courtyards, in fields beneath the relentless sun. And with such a life came constant challenges of hygiene, health, and survival. Egypt's climate was both a blessing and a burden. The hot, dry air helped preserve bodies for millennia, but for those who lived through it, the heat brought its own difficulties. Dust and sand clung to the skin, blew into eyes, and coated food. With no running water, bathing was a task that required time, effort, and access to the Nile or to wells. For wealthier families, servants could bring jars of water for washing, but for poorer women, cleaning meant carrying heavy jars from the river and rationing what little could be spared. Still, Egyptians valued cleanliness. In tomb paintings, men and women are often depicted freshly bathed, their skin smooth, their hair neatly arranged. Women oiled their skin to prevent dryness, rubbed fragrant unguents into their hair, and sometimes wore cones of scented wax that melted slowly in the sun, releasing perfume. These practices not only masked unpleasant odors, but also softened skin roughened by labor. But beyond appearances, hygiene was a constant battle. Without proper sewage systems, most households used simple clay pots or open spaces as toilets. Waste often found its way back to the Nile, the same river that provided drinking water. It was a cycle that spread disease quickly. Dysentery, typhoid, and intestinal parasites were common companions, cutting lives short and making daily work far harder. For women, the risks of illness were compounded by the demands of childbearing. Pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous, claiming the lives of perhaps 1 in 3 women. Without medical knowledge of infection or hemorrhage, even a small complication could prove fatal. Midwives, often older women of the village, attended births, armed with herbs, amulets, and whispered prayers to the goddess Tauret, the protector of mothers and children. Sometimes, their efforts brought joy and new life. Other times, they ended in silence and grief. Even outside of childbirth, women carried a heavy burden of health risks. Their diets, while sustaining, were not always ideal. Bread, made from stone, ground flour, contained tiny particles of grit that wore down teeth over time. Dental abscesses and infections were common, and without treatment, they could be deadly. The prevalence of beer helped provide hydration, but it also carried contaminants, leading to frequent stomach illnesses. Parasites, too, thrived in Egypt's warm waters. Schistosomiasis, a disease caused by parasites in the Nile, affected countless Egyptians. Symptoms included pain, fatigue, and organ damage, yet most endured it as an unavoidable part of life. Women, who spent much of their time washing clothes or drawing water, were especially vulnerable. Despite these challenges, there were practices aimed at preserving health. Egyptians used herbs and minerals for remedies, garlic and honey for infections, willow bark for pain, castor oil for digestive troubles. Women sometimes brewed teas of chamomile or mint to soothe stomachs, or applied poultices of crushed plants to wounds. Spells and incantations accompanied treatments, for illness was often seen as both physical and spiritual. The line between medicine and magic was thin, and women, who managed much of the household, were often the first healers. For the wealthy, health was easier to guard. Their homes had private bathing spaces, and their diets included more variety: fruits, vegetables, and fish alongside bread and beer. Servants could carry water, grind grain, and prepare meals, sparing elite women from some of the wear and tear of labor. Yet even queens and noblewomen could not escape the dangers of childbirth or disease. The mummies of royal women often reveal arthritis, dental decay, and the same intestinal parasites that plagued the poor. Old age, when it was reached, was often accompanied by frailty. For women who survived the hazards of childbirth and disease, their later years brought new trials. With no sons to support them, widows might find themselves dependent on distant relatives or charity from temples. Those who were fortunate enough to be cared for might still suffer from failing vision, aching joints, and the slow decline of the body. Yet through all these hardships, women found ways to care for themselves and each other. Baths in the cool Nile at dusk, shared meals of lentils and bread, the comfort of family and community. These small acts of daily life offered moments of peace. And while hygiene and health were constant challenges, they were also shared experiences, binding women together in resilience. Imagine, as night falls, a woman washing her children's faces with water from a clay jar, brushing dust from their hair. Picture her lighting a small oil lamp, its flame flickering softly, as she mixes herbs in a stone bowl to ease her husband's cough. These are the quiet scenes that rarely appear in grand histories, but they carry the heartbeat of ancient Egypt. They remind us that behind the monuments and mummies were women who lived, suffered, healed, and endured. So as you rest now, let the thought of their resilience be a gentle balm. Theirs was not an easy life, but it was one of care, of endurance, and of small triumphs against constant odds. And in their quiet strength, we glimpse the true foundation of the civilization that still fascinates us today. To truly understand the life of women in ancient Egypt, we must pause and turn our attention to children, those fragile sparks of new life that defined the rhythm of the family. For an Egyptian woman, motherhood was both her greatest role and her greatest risk. Children were cherished, but they were also precarious. their lives hanging by a thread in a world without modern medicine. Imagine a small mud-brick courtyard on the edge of a village. The morning sun has just risen, and a young mother cradles her infant as she grinds grain on a heavy stone quern. The baby fusses, reaching for her necklace of beads, while an older sibling stirs a clay pot of lentils over a small fire. Nearby, a grandmother weaves palm fibers into a mat, humming a soft tune to soothe the little ones. This scene, repeated countless times across the Nile Valley, reveals the central place of children in daily life. For women, bearing children was both expected and necessary. Families were large, for many children did not survive infancy. Some scholars estimate that as many as half of all children died before the age of 5. Illness, accidents, poor nutrition, and infections claimed lives quickly, often without warning. Every birth was a moment of hope shadowed by fear. Childbirth itself was fraught with danger. Women gave birth squatting on birthing stools, or crouching with the aid of female relatives and midwives. They called upon Tauret, the hippopotamus goddess of fertility and protection, and Bes, the dwarf god who frightened away evil spirits. Amulets of these deities were often placed near the birthing mother, small tokens of comfort in a time of peril. Still, with limited medical knowledge, even the simplest complication could mean tragedy. When children survived, they became the heart of the household. They played in the dust of courtyards, splashing in the Nile's shallows, chasing geese or goats. Little boys often ran unclothed until adolescence, while girls wore simple linen dresses. Toys made of wood, clay, or linen scraps entertained them, spinning tops, carved dolls, small balls, and miniature animals. Even in the ancient world, laughter and play filled the air where children gathered. Education was rare for girls, but some boys, particularly from wealthier families, might learn to read and write at temple schools. Girls were more often taught domestic skills by their mothers: weaving, grinding grain, cooking, and caring for younger siblings. From an early age, children absorbed the rhythm of adult life, learning tasks that would one day sustain their own households. The bond between mother and child was deep, but it was tempered by the reality of mortality. A fever could sweep through a household, carrying away a beloved toddler. An accident at the river could claim a young life in an instant. For women, such losses were devastatingly common. Tom inscriptions and stela sometimes express grief for children who died young, though many more names were lost to silence. And yet, even in loss, the cycle of family life continued. Women often bore many children, not only out of cultural expectation, but also because survival demanded it. Sons, especially, were vital, for they would care for their mothers in old age, perform funerary rites, and continue the family line. Daughters, though equally cherished, were often married off, their futures tied to another household. The family itself was both shelter and responsibility. Grandparents, parents, children, and sometimes cousins lived close together, sharing labor and resources. Older women cared for infants while younger mothers worked. Fathers taught sons farming or craft work, while daughters shadowed their mothers. In this way, the cycle of family life was constant, woven tightly into the survival of the community. Mortality was not only a reality, but also a teacher. It shaped the way Egyptians thought about the afterlife. Parents prayed for their children's protection, not only in this world but in the next. Small coffins, carefully painted, have been discovered for children, their burials carried out with tenderness and ritual. To lose a child was to lose a piece of the family's future, but it was also to entrust that child to the gods. And when women themselves aged, they looked to their children for care. A widow without sons might face hardship, while one with a strong family around her could find comfort in her later years. Children were the promise that, despite hardship and loss, life continued. Picture now the quiet of evening in an Egyptian village. A mother gathers her children close, as she tells them a story of gods and heroes. A father repairs a fishing net by the doorway, listening to the children's giggles. The fire burns low, casting flickering shadows on mud-brick walls. For all the struggles of mortality, there were also moments of joy, of belonging, of love that transcended hardship. As you drift into sleep, imagine the sound of children laughing by the Nile, their voices rising above the murmur of water and the rustle of reeds. These fleeting sounds carried hope into a world shadowed by loss. For women, children were both burden and blessing, risk and reward. They were the fragile thread that bound each generation to the next, weaving families together across centuries. In their laughter and in their absence, children shaped the rhythm of women's lives, reminding us that even in a harsh world, love and care found ways to endure. In the great sweep of Egypt's history, with its pharaohs and temples, the lives of ordinary women rarely appear. Yet one truth quietly threaded through their existence. Survival into old age was both a rarity and a fragile gift. For most women, reaching the later stages of life meant not freedom, but a new set of vulnerabilities. Widowhood, failing health, and dependence upon children or kin shaped their final years. Imagine an elderly woman seated in the shade of a mud-brick wall. Her back curved from years of grinding grain, her hands gnarled by weaving and work. She watches her grandchildren chase one another through the dust, a faint smile tugging at her weathered face. She has lived through childbirth, through illness, through the long labor of sustaining her family. Yet now, her survival depends not on her own strength, but on the care of those around her. In ancient Egypt, family was the foundation of security for older women. Sons were especially important, for they were expected to provide food, clothing, and protection. A woman whose son survived into adulthood might enjoy relative stability, her twilight years softened by their support. Her daughters, though often married into other households, could also lend comfort, returning to visit and bringing gifts of bread, beer, or linen. But the picture was far less secure for women who outlived their husbands and had no surviving sons. A widow without family might find herself vulnerable, forced to rely on charity from temples or neighbors. Some temples offered sanctuary, taking in widows as servants in exchange for food and lodging. Others might be left adrift, dependent upon the goodwill of extended kin or at the mercy of strangers. Life expectancy itself was short by modern standards. Many women never saw their 40th year, and those who did often bore the physical toll of hard labor and repeated pregnancies. Archaeological evidence from mummies shows arthritis, dental decay, and brittle bones, signs of lives worn down by constant strain. To grow old was rare enough, to grow old with health was rarer still. Widowhood brought its own hardships. A woman's legal and social identity was closely tied to her husband. With his death, she might inherit property or household goods, but she also lost the protection of his name. Unless her sons could take over this role, she risked becoming invisible in the eyes of society. In a culture where men signed contracts, owned land, and represented families in court, a widow's independence was often more symbolic than real. Yet, for some, widowhood could also bring a measure of quiet freedom. Freed from the demands of childbirth and the daily control of a husband, older women sometimes became advisors within their households. They carried knowledge of herbs, remedies, and rituals. They taught daughters and granddaughters the skills of weaving, baking, or child-rearing. In this way, even frailty could give way to authority, their voices guiding the next generation. Still, the shadow of poverty loomed large. Without strong family support, elderly women might be forced to beg or barter small goods for survival. In some cases, widows joined temple communities, dedicating themselves to serving gods in exchange for sustenance. This was not a life of luxury but of survival, a fragile bargain between devotion and necessity. Death itself was not feared in the way we might imagine. Egyptians believed in the afterlife, and for many women, the hope of reunion with loved ones provided comfort. Funerary practices, however, were costly, and poorer women might not be granted elaborate burials. Simple graves, unadorned except for a few amulets or pots of food, marked their passage into eternity. The wealthier might rest beneath stelae inscribed with prayers, their names preserved for generations. Picture, for a moment, an elderly widow lying on a woven mat as night settles over her village. Her joints ache, her breath is shallow, but beside her, a daughter whispers softly, offering water and a scrap of bread. In that simple act of care lies the essence of survival, love passed from one generation to the next, binding the fragile chain of family. And so, the final chapter of a woman's life in ancient Egypt was not marked by power or glory, but by dependence, endurance, and hope. Some found comfort in the embrace of family, their twilight years softened by care. Others faced loneliness and want, their stories swallowed by silence. But whether cherished or forgotten, they carried with them the quiet dignity of survival in a world that demanded so much. As you drift toward sleep, imagine their lives as candles burning low, some flickering gently in the company of loved ones, others guttering in solitude. Each flame was fragile, yet each added its light to the long night of history. And though their names may be lost, their endurance lingers still, woven into the fabric of the civilization they sustained. Religion was the beating heart of ancient Egypt. Temples soared above the villages, priests carried out elaborate rituals, and gods were woven into every corner of daily life. For women, faith offered both comfort and constraint, a source of hope and identity, yet also a reminder of the limits placed upon them. To walk through the sacred halls of Egypt's religion was to glimpse both the divine and the barriers that kept most women at its threshold. Picture a temple at dawn. The rising sun casts golden light across tall pylons carved with hieroglyphs. Priests, shaven, headed and clad in spotless linen, prepare for the daily ritual of awakening the god. Incense curls upward, filling the air with the scent of myrrh. The sanctuary is quiet, save for the murmured prayers and the rustle of linen robes. This, the heart of Egypt's spiritual life, was largely closed to women. Unlike in some later societies, Egyptian women were not entirely excluded from religion. They prayed at household shrines, left offerings at local temples, and invoked protective deities in childbirth or sickness. Goddesses like Isis, Hathor, and Tauret held powerful roles in myth, embodying motherhood, love, and protection. Women drew strength from these figures, finding reflections of their own lives in divine form. Yet the official priesthood, the elite circle who performed temple rituals, interpreted omens, and communed with the gods, was overwhelmingly male. Why? In part, because ritual purity was prized above all else. Priests shaved their bodies, bathed multiple times daily, and observed strict taboos. Women, associated with menstruation and childbirth, were often considered ritually impure for long stretches of time. This belief barred them from the inner sanctuaries of temples, leaving them on the margins of formal religious life. Still, there were exceptions. Some women rose to prominence within the temple system, particularly in roles connected to music and ritual performance. The title of Chantress of Amun, or Singer of Hathor, was granted to women who provided sacred music during ceremonies. With sistrums, rattling instruments of bronze and faience, they shook rhythms that were believed to please the gods and drive away evil. Their songs filled the vast halls of Karnak and Luxor, their voices weaving sound into stone. In certain periods, especially the New Kingdom, a powerful female office emerged, the God's Wife of Amun. This was a religious title given to royal women, often the daughters of pharaohs, who performed rituals and held considerable influence in Thebes. The position combined politics with piety, giving these women authority over temple lands and revenues. Yet such roles were reserved for the elite, far removed from the lives of ordinary women along the Nile. For most, religion was lived in smaller, humbler ways. Household shrines, simple niches with painted images or clay figurines, stood in kitchens or courtyards. Women prayed here for fertility, health, and protection, lighting small oil lamps or leaving offerings of bread and beer. Birth, illness, and death, the great thresholds of life, were steeped in ritual, with women at the center. They tied amulets of bez around infants' necks, recited spells during childbirth, and mourned the dead with wailing that echoed through the streets. Funerary rituals offered another sphere of participation. Women were often depicted as mourners in tomb scenes, their arms raised in grief, their hair unbound as a sign of sorrow. Professional female mourners, hired to perform ritual lamentations, played a vital role in guiding the dead into the afterlife. Their voices carried across tomb courtyards, blending sorrow with sanctity, reminding the living of both loss and hope. Religion, then, was both empowering and limiting. It gave women symbols of strength in goddesses who embodied their struggles, and it allowed them to act as protectors of the home and guardians of life's passages. Yet the great temples, repositories of wealth and power, remained closed to all but a chosen few. To be a woman in ancient Egypt was to stand outside the sanctuary, watching the smoke of incense rise, knowing that faith belonged as much to the priests as to the people. And still, the gods were present everywhere. In the hum of bees, thought to be the tears of Ra, in the lotus blossom, symbol of rebirth, in the flicker of a household lamp. Women may have been excluded from the innermost rituals, but they carried faith in their daily lives. Their prayers whispered over cradles, their songs sung in courtyards, their offerings placed at village shrines. All these were acts of devotion, as real as the grandest temple rite. As night falls in our journey, imagine a woman kneeling before a small clay figure of Isis, her hands folded, her voice low. She prays for her child's health, for her husband's safe return, for strength in her own weary body. Outside the grand temples, away from the golden altars, faith lived quietly in such moments. For the women of ancient Egypt, religion was not always about power. It was about endurance, hope, and the unseen bonds between the mortal and the divine. For most women in ancient Egypt, life unfolded within narrow boundaries. Yet there were rare exceptions, extraordinary figures who stepped beyond the confines of expectation and seized roles usually reserved for men. These were the queens, the regents, the rulers who left their mark on history. Though their stories were exceptional rather than typical, they remind us that even in a world bound by patriarchy, some women found ways to wield power. Picture a palace at dawn. The walls are painted with lotus blossoms and hunting scenes, the air rich with the scent of lilies. Servants bustle quietly as a queen prepares to appear before her court. Draped in fine linen, adorned with gold and lapis jewelry, she moves with grace, aware that every gesture carries meaning. Behind her beauty lies strategy, for her survival depends not only on her lineage, but also on her ability to navigate a world that rarely tolerated women in power. Perhaps the most famous of these figures is Hatshepsut, the queen who became pharaoh. After her husband Thutmose II died, she initially ruled as regent for her young stepson. Yet over time, she claimed the throne for herself, adopting royal titles, and even depicting herself as male in statues and reliefs. With a false beard and muscular torso, her reign was long and prosperous, marked by grand building projects and expeditions to Punt, bringing wealth and exotic goods to Egypt. Though later rulers tried to erase her from memory, chiseling her name from monuments, her achievements endure, carved into stone that still stands today. Another striking figure is Nefertiti, wife of Akhenaten. Together, they presided over one of Egypt's most unusual periods, when the pharaoh abandoned traditional gods in favor of worshipping the Aten, the sun disk. Nefertiti was not a shadowy consort, but a visible partner. depicted in art alongside her husband, shown smiting enemies and offering to the gods. Some scholars believe she may even have ruled briefly after his death, her name hidden under another guise. Though her fate remains uncertain, her face, immortalized in a painted limestone bust, has become one of the most iconic images of ancient Egypt. And, of course, there is Cleopatra Vassi, the last of the Ptolemaic queens, who ruled more than 1,000 years after the pyramids were built. Fluent in multiple languages, shrewd in politics, Cleopatra secured her throne through alliances with Rome's most powerful men, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Though her story is often told through the lens of tragedy and romance, she was above all a strategist, determined to preserve Egypt's independence. Her reign ended with her death, but her legend lives on, entwining beauty with ambition in the memory of history. These queens were not typical. Their power rested on extraordinary circumstances: the death of male heirs, political upheaval, or dynastic necessity. For every Hatshepsut or Cleopatra, countless other women lived and died without recognition, their names lost in the dust. And even these powerful queens often faced erasure. Hatshepsut's monuments were defaced, Nefertiti's fate hidden, Cleopatra vilified by Roman historians. Power won by women was precarious, tolerated only until it threatened to disrupt the order of kingship. Still, their stories reveal something important: that even in a deeply patriarchal society, women could step into power when the moment demanded it. They were anomalies, yes, but they were also reminders of the potential that existed beneath the surface. For the ordinary women grinding grain, weaving cloth, or bearing children, queens like Hatshepsut or Cleopatra must have seemed distant figures. Yet their reigns showed that the gods themselves could sanction a woman's rule, however briefly. Queenship also extended beyond political rule. Royal women were central to dynastic stability, their marriages forging alliances, their sons securing succession. A queen's womb was a vessel of legitimacy, her role not merely ornamental, but deeply tied to the survival of the dynasty. In tombs and temples, they appear beside their husbands, smaller in scale but vital in symbolism, the counterpart without whom kingship itself was incomplete. And yet, these queens remind us of the duality of women's lives in Egypt. On the one hand, most were barred from power, excluded from priesthoods and politics. On the other, a select few stood at the pinnacle of authority, shaping Egypt's destiny in ways that still echo today. Their lives capture the tension between exclusion and exception, between silence and visibility. As night deepens, imagine Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahari, its terraces rising against the cliffs, bathed in moonlight. Picture Nefertiti gazing toward the Aten, her profile illuminated in golden rays. Envision Cleopatra on her barge along the Nile, sails perfumed, eyes fixed on the horizon of fate. These are not merely legends but glimpses of what women, against all odds, achieved in ancient Egypt. So, as you drift into rest, let their stories remind you that history is never just one tale. It is a tapestry of voices, some silenced, some exalted, some forgotten, some immortalized. Among them, the voices of Egypt's queens whisper still, carrying across the centuries, defying the silence that sought to erase them. When we speak of queens like Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, or Cleopatra, their names echo through time, carved into monuments or retold in legend. Yet, for every royal woman whose story survived, there were millions of others whose lives passed quietly, unnoticed, their existence marked only by fleeting traces in the archaeological record. This is the silent majority, the countless women who lived and died in ancient Egypt, their voices swallowed by time. Imagine for a moment standing in a small mud brick house in a village along the Nile. The walls are rough, patched with straw and clay. The roof low and cool against the blazing sun outside. Inside, a woman kneels at a grinding stone, her hands moving rhythmically as she crushes grain into flour. A child tugs at her linen dress, hungry for bread that is still hours away. In the corner, jars of water, beer, and oil line the wall, carefully rationed to last through the week. This woman has no statues, no inscriptions, no temple walls to preserve her likeness. And yet, she was as much a part of Egypt's history as any queen or king. The vast majority of women in Egypt lived in such obscurity. Their work sustained families, communities, and the very kingdom itself. They baked bread, brewed beer, wove cloth, tended animals, raised children, and managed households. Without their labor, Egypt's great monuments and armies could not have been supported. Yet, because they left little behind in writing or stone, their stories are the hardest to tell. Archaeologists sometimes find hints of their presence: a necklace buried with its owner, worn smooth by years of use, a child's toy doll made of linen, tucked beside a young mother's body in a grave, fragments of graffiti, scrawled on the walls of workers' villages, where women are mentioned only in passing. These are the faintest whispers of lives once lived, lives that mattered deeply to those who knew them. The silence of ordinary women is not unusual in history. Across cultures, it is often the rulers, the generals, the priests, and the wealthy whose records survive. The poor, the laborers, and especially women, who were rarely taught to read or write, are left invisible. Yet invisibility does not mean insignificance. In fact, it was precisely the unseen, unrecorded toil of these women that allowed Egypt's civilization to endure for 3,000 years. Consider childbirth, one of the defining experiences for many women. Records from medical papyri describe remedies, prayers, and charms, but the actual voices of the women who endured these labors are lost. We do not hear their fears, their joys, or their grief when a child was lost. And yet, in every home across Egypt, these moments were central, shaping families and communities. For each Nefertiti, whose daughters are listed in inscriptions, there were thousands of mothers whose children's names have vanished with the sand. Even when women appeared in tombs, they were often secondary figures, shown beside their husbands or fathers. Their names might be recorded, but their thoughts and experiences were rarely preserved. Imagine being painted on a wall to symbolize a marriage bond, your likeness frozen forever, in a scene of feasting or farming, but with no words to describe who you truly were. You are remembered, but not known. And then there were the women who were never recorded at all: servants in temples, field workers on estates, widows who begged for bread, midwives who moved quietly from home to home, offering their skill and comfort. These women lived full lives, laughed, sang, mourned, and loved, but the centuries have swallowed them almost entirely. Their silence is the great expanse of history, vast and humbling. To imagine them is to recognize that history is not only the story of the powerful, but also the story of the ordinary. When we walk through the ruins of an Egyptian village, stepping carefully over shards of pottery and fragments of tools, we are treading where they once lived. Each worn threshold, each hearth blackened with smoke, carries the memory of hands that built fires, cooked meals, and soothed children to sleep. Perhaps it is fitting, then, that in our quiet reflection, we bring them back into focus. Though we cannot know their names, we can acknowledge their presence. They were the invisible threads of Egypt's great tapestry, woven into the everyday fabric of life. They bore the weight of survival, shouldered burdens that left no monument, and yet, without them, there would have been no Egypt at all. As the night deepens and you sink further into rest, picture the silent majority women, kneeling at grinding stones, their hands moving in a timeless rhythm, women singing softly to babies by the riverbank, women gathering reeds for baskets, or tending small fires outside their homes. Picture them not as forgotten, but as part of the living heartbeat of their world. Their voices may not have reached us, but in the rustle of the desert wind and the lapping of the Nile, perhaps their echoes still linger, soft and eternal. In ancient Egypt, death was not considered an ending but a transformation, a passage from one realm to another. Life was fleeting, uncertain, filled with labor and hardship, but the afterlife promised renewal, abundance, and eternal peace. For women, as for men, death was the doorway into this other world. Yet, the rituals, beliefs, and expectations of this journey reveal much about how Egyptian society understood a woman's place, not only in life, but also beyond it. Imagine the hush of a household where a woman has just passed. The body is laid carefully on a reed mat, the air heavy with incense, meant to mask the scent of mortality. Wailing women gather outside, professional mourners hired to lament the loss, their voices rising in rhythmic cries that echo like waves of sorrow. In these moments, the ties of community became visible, with grief shared, not hidden, for death was both a personal and a public experience. If the family could afford it, the woman's body would be entrusted to embalmers. There, in a workshop along the edge of the desert, rituals were performed with solemn precision. Organs were removed and placed in canopic jars, the body dried with natron, and the skin wrapped in layer upon layer of linen. Amulets were tucked between the wrappings, charms of protection, prayers in physical form. A scarab might rest over her heart, to ensure it spoke truth when weighed in the judgment of the gods. Each step was guided by tradition, a careful preparation for eternity. For wealthier women, the coffin itself was an elaborate work of art. Painted eyes allowed the deceased to see, even in death. Hieroglyphs lined the surface, spells from the Book of the Dead to guide her safely through the trials of the underworld. Scenes of offering showed her receiving bread, beer, and perfume from the gods, a promise of abundance in the life to come. Poorer women, however, might be laid in simple reed mats or rough wooden coffins, their journey more modest, yet no less filled with hope. The beliefs of the afterlife centered on Osiris, Lord of the Dead, and Ma'at, the principle of truth and balance. Every soul, male or female, faced the same trial, the weighing of the heart. The heart was placed on a scale opposite the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was heavy with sin, it would be devoured by Amit, the fearsome devourer, and the soul would cease to exist. But if it balanced true, the woman would pass into the field of reeds, a paradise where she would live forever. In this eternal land, the hardships of earthly life melted away. A woman who had toiled at grinding grain and hauling water might find herself surrounded by plenty, with fields that watered themselves, and bread that never ran out, loved ones reunited, and time no longer pressed so cruelly. Death, so often a companion in life, became the threshold to a gentler existence. Still, women carried into death the roles assigned to them in life. Tom inscriptions describe women as beloved wives or mothers, their identities tied closely to family. Even in the afterlife, they were often depicted serving their husbands or joining them in rituals before the gods. This reflects the patriarchal structure of Egypt, where a woman's identity was framed by her relationships. Yet, there are also moments where individuality shines through. A woman named, her beauty praised, her piety recorded. In these glimpses, we see more than just a role, we see a person remembered. Not all women had the same funerary opportunities. The wealthy could afford grand tombs carved into cliffs, with painted walls showing banquets, music, and offerings. The poor were often buried in communal pits, their remains exposed to shifting sands. Yet even the humblest burial carried within it the hope of eternal life, for belief in the afterlife was not limited by wealth. To the ancient Egyptians, death was universal, and so too was the yearning for rebirth. The role of women as mourners also played a sacred part in the rituals of death. In funerary processions, women often embodied the goddesses Isis and Nephthys, who had wept for their brother Osiris. Their laments were seen as more than grief. They were acts of power, summoning divine protection for the deceased. In this way, women became guardians of transition, their voices bridging the gap between the living and the dead. As the stars brightened over the desert, the burial would conclude. The coffin was lowered into the tomb, offerings placed nearby, jars of food, linens, perfumes, and sometimes shabty figurines to work in the afterlife on her behalf. The tomb was sealed, and the family departed, leaving their loved one to her eternal journey. In the quiet, the desert wind would sweep over the stones, carrying her spirit toward the field of reeds. So, as you drift deeper into rest, imagine this final journey. The woman steps into the afterlife, her linen wrappings shimmering like moonlight. Her heart is weighed, light as a feather, and she passes into eternal fields, where flowers never fade, where rivers flow endlessly, and where joy is everlasting. In her rebirth, she is no longer bound by toil or sorrow, but free, a soul at peace beneath the eternal sky of Egypt. The story of women in ancient Egypt is not one tale but many, some carved in stone, others carried only in whispers through the ages. Their lives stretched across millennia, woven into the rise and fall of dynasties, the flood and retreat of the Nile, the everyday rhythms of grinding grain, raising children, weaving linen, and mourning the dead. Though most left no names for us to remember, their presence shaped one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. Close your eyes and picture the sands of Egypt today. The pyramids still stand. The temples of Karnak and Luxor rise in solemn grandeur. The Valley of the Kings lies quiet beneath a blazing sun. Tourists wander among ruins, their footsteps echoing against walls inscribed thousands of years ago. And yet, beneath this grandeur, there are the invisible lives. The women who ground the flour for the workers' bread, who stitched the sails for the Nile's boats, who comforted children in the shadow of monumental stone. Their fingerprints remain, unseen yet eternal. The legacy of these women lies not only in what they endured, but in what they sustained. Through famine, plague, political upheaval, and conquest, it was often women who anchored families, who carried traditions, who ensured survival in the face of uncertainty. They were not rulers of kingdoms, but rulers of households, shaping the daily lives that held Egypt together. Their legacy is survival itself, whispered down through the generations. And yet, there were also the luminous exceptions, queens like Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, and Cleopatra, who bent the rules of power and claimed thrones that were never meant for them. Their names remind us that even within systems built to silence women, brilliance found ways to shine through. They were symbols of possibility, reminders that history is never as fixed as it seems. Though some tried to erase them, chiseling their names from walls or rewriting their stories, their images and legends endured, refusing to be silenced. Modern historians and archaeologists work tirelessly to uncover more of these hidden stories. Each fragment of pottery, each scrap of papyrus, each painted tomb wall has the potential to bring us closer to the everyday women of Egypt. Sometimes it is only a name scratched into stone, a mother, a daughter, a wife. But even this small detail expands our understanding of lives once thought invisible. The more we search, the clearer it becomes women were not merely shadows in the background of history. They were participants, contributors, creators of continuity. There is also a lesson here, one that stretches beyond the boundaries of time and geography. To study the lives of Egyptian women is to remember that history is not only the story of kings and generals, but of families and workers, of those whose voices rarely make it into official records. It is to recognize that every civilization rests upon countless invisible hands, and that those hands, though forgotten by names, left impressions that endure in ways more profound than any monument. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine the echoes of these women carried on the desert wind. Hear the laughter of children by the Nile, the murmur of lullabies sung in homes now lost to sand. Picture the strong arms of women grinding grain, the nimble fingers weaving linen, the voices rising in song at weddings, and in mourning at funerals. Imagine queens gazing from gilded thrones, and ordinary women tending fires in humble hearths, all bound together, all threads of the same great tapestry. The legacy of Egyptian women is not only in stone but in spirit. It lingers in the endurance of humanity itself, in the reminder that even the smallest lives are part of the grand story of history. They lived, they worked, they loved, they dreamed. And in remembering them, we honor not only the past, but also the quiet strength that carries through every age. As your eyes grow heavy, let this final thought carry you gently toward rest. Though time erases names, it cannot erase existence. The women of ancient Egypt, from queens to field workers, still whisper through the ages. Their voices rise softly in the night, reminding us that every life matters, that every story has weight, and that even the forgotten are never truly gone.